Now, how can the federal government seriously justify its decision not to oppose the release of a terrorist into the community? Abdul Nacer Benbrika is set to be released on Saturday. He plotted to bomb the MCG, Crown Casino in Melbourne, and the Lucas Heights nuclear reactor in Sydney. When his 15-year sentence ended in 2020, the Morrison government applied for a continuing detention order, which allows the court to re-detain terrorists at the end of their sentence if they pose an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence. The court, of course, agreed. It clearly thought Benbrika was a risk and locked him up for another 3 years. But with that order expiring at the end of the week, Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has decided not to apply for another continuing detention order and instead a 3-year extended supervision order. So he'll be out in the community and someone will supposedly be keeping an eye on him. Just 3 years ago, the federal government, 15 years after he was sentenced, believed he was still a terror risk. The court agreed. That's why he was locked up again. But another 3 years down the line, we're meant to believe he's no longer enough of a threat to justify his detention. Mr Dreyfus's office told the Herald Sun today that if there is no proper factual or legal basis for making an application for a continuing detention order, it is not legally possible for the Attorney-General to make such an application. How can there be no proper factual or legal basis on which to seek the detention of a terrorist? But I guess we know the Attorney-General has been a real stickler for respecting the law lately.
I will not be apologising for upholding the law. I will not be apologising for pursuing the rule of law, and I will not be apologising for acting. Do not interrupt. I will not be apologising for acting. I will not be apologising for acting in accordance with a High Court decision. Your question is an absurd one.
How funny that he gets all worked up about defending himself and his government, but he's not so enthusiastic about defending us from convicted terrorists. That spray at Sky News reporter Olivia Casely was, of course, in relation to the hundreds of immigration detainees, many of them hardened criminals, who were released into the community after the High Court decided their detention was invalid. Some of these people, as we know, have allegedly reoffended, including assault. All Ms Casely asked was whether the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill would apologise to the alleged victims of these released detainees, and then Dreyfus went off his brain. But he rather missed the point, just as he is missing it now with Benbrika. No one denies that the decision to release immigration detainees was made by the High Court. It wasn't a decision of the government. But what was a decision of the government was whether or not to draft and pass legislation that would allow these people to be re-detained. They didn't do it. It didn't come until after some of them allegedly reoffended. You could have fixed the problem before it started, but you chose not to. And again, in this case with Benbrika, you have the opportunity to apply to the court for him to be re-detained, and you're choosing not to. And again, you dress it up in this nonsense about how it's just upholding the law. You say it's not legally possible because there's no factual or legal basis to do so. In which case, we are owed an explanation as to what has changed. How, if Benbrika was a danger to the country 3 years ago, is he not anymore? Has the bloke been deradicalised in the past 3 years, despite the fact it didn't happen in the 15 years before that? Again, a continuing detention order can be imposed if someone poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorism offence. What about Benbrika has changed in the last 3 years that means the Attorney-General believes he is not a risk to the community? We haven't received any such explanation. And not only are we releasing a convicted terrorist, we're releasing him into a world where the risk of terror and tensions between the West and Islamists are heightened. The past few years have been pretty cruisy in terms of our concern about terror. The world's been reasonably stable and there hasn't been much worry of terrorism at home. How quickly we forget, of course. I mean, it was 9 years ago this month that the Lindt Cafe siege happened in Sydney. There were 6 Islamist terror attacks in Australia between 2015 and 2018 and one planned attack that was stopped. Since then, things have been pretty quiet. But now we have this war between Israel and Palestine, and it's raised racial and religious tensions in a way we haven't seen in years. And it has, of course, inspired tens of thousands of people to march through the streets of capital cities in support of a genocidal Islamist regime. I mean, for heaven's sake, the day after the October 7 massacre of Jews committed by Hamas in Israel, we had people on the steps of the Opera House shouting, "Gas the Jews," and a warning some people may find this footage distressing. The New South Wales Police, by the way, still can't work out whether they heard what we all heard in that footage. But this is the environment into which Benbrika is about to be released. A time when you can shout "Gas the Jews" and no one does anything about it. A time when there's seemingly wide support from useful idiots for an Islamist terror group in Hamas. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Malcolm Davis warned of this danger today.
Dan Tien is correct. The threat has got worse. If you look at October the 7th and the events after that, and the risks of radical Palestinian supporters or Hamas sympathisers in this country taking action against Australia, I think that's very real. So I think it is a risk that should not be taken.
This is the fire pit that helps breed terror. Terrorists believe in what they do. They believe it is the right thing, that they're serving a higher purpose and a righteous cause. The scenes we've witnessed on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney, the synagogues targeted, the hostage posters ripped down, this all sends a message to would-be terrorists. Now, maybe Benbrika has been miraculously deradicalised in the past 3 years. It seems highly unlikely, but who knows? But even if the Attorney-General felt comfortable that he was not currently of the mind to plan and carry out an attack, surely it's obvious that we live in a time when radicalisation is more likely than it has been for a while. Just as the government was missing in action in the release of immigration detainees, they're missing in action on the release of a terrorist. And when they're called on it, they just go, "Oh, we're upholding the law." Well, newsflash. You make the law. Do something about it.